We are going to take a peaceful journey back through time to ancient Egypt, where the mighty Nile River was not just water flowing through the desert, but the very heartbeat of an entire civilization. We will explore the legends, the gods, and the everyday people who lived their lives along its sacred banks, discovering stories that have been passed down for thousands of years. This is a journey of relaxation, wonder, and connection to one of humanity's most fascinating ancient cultures. Before we go back in time together, if you're enjoying settling in for the night with a bit of Egyptian history, consider hitting subscribe. And I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 1. The river that gave birth to a civilization. Asterisk, asterisk. Have you ever wondered why ancient Egypt became one of the most powerful civilizations in human history when it was surrounded by nothing but endless desert? The answer lies in a single river that flowed like a blue ribbon through an ocean of sand. The Nile River was not just important to the ancient Egyptians. It was everything. It was life itself. Picture yourself standing on the banks of the Nile River over 4,000 years ago. The sun is beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflect off the water's surface. The air is warm but not uncomfortably hot anymore as evening approaches. You can hear the gentle lapping of water against the muddy banks, and in the distance you see small papyrus boats gliding across the water, their occupants returning home after a long day of fishing. The smell of wet earth fills your nostrils, that rich, fertile scent that promises life in a land that would otherwise be barren. The ancient Egyptians called their river simply Ar or Or, which meant black, referring to the rich black soil that the river deposited along its banks every single year. The name Nile actually comes from the Greek word Nilos, which later civilizations used to describe this magnificent waterway. But to the people who lived along its shores in ancient times, this river was so much more than just a body of water with a name. It was a god. It was a mother. It was a father. It was the difference between life and death. The Nile River stretches over 4,000 miles, making it one of the longest rivers in the entire world. It flows northward, which confused many ancient travellers because most rivers flow south. But the Nile had its own path, its own wisdom, flowing from the heart of Africa all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. Along the way, it carved out a valley through the desert, creating a thin strip of green land in a world of yellow and brown sand. This strip of fertility was rarely more than a few miles wide, but it was enough. It was enough to feed millions of people. It was enough to build pyramids. It was enough to create a civilization that would last for over 3,000 years. But why was the Nile so special? What made it different from other rivers? The answer lies in a miracle that happened every single year without fail. A miracle so important that the entire Egyptian calendar was built around it. This miracle was the annual flood. Every year, starting around June, the waters of the Nile would begin to rise, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until the river overflowed its banks and spread across the land. This was not a destructive flood like we might imagine today. This was a gentle, life-giving flood that brought with it something precious beyond measure. The floodwaters carried rich, black silt from the highlands of Ethiopia and Central Africa, soil so fertile that anything planted in it would grow abundantly. When the waters receded in September, they left behind this gift of soil, transforming the landscape into the perfect farmland. The ancient Egyptians divided their entire year around this flooding cycle. They had 3 seasons, each lasting 4 months. The first season was called Akhet, which meant inundation. This was the flooding season, lasting from June to September. During Akhet, the fields were underwater and farmers could not work their land. Instead, this was the time when many of them would work on the pharaoh's building projects, constructing temples, pyramids, and monuments that still stand today. It was during Akhet that the Great Pyramids were built, stone by massive stone, because the farmers needed work and the floodwaters made it easier to transport heavy stones by boat. The second season was called Peret, meaning emergence. This season lasted from October to February, and it was the time when the waters receded and the land emerged once again, covered in that precious layer of black silt. This was planting season. Farmers would plough their fields, often using simple wooden ploughs pulled by cattle, and they would scatter seeds across the fertile ground. Wheat and barley were the most important crops, providing the grain needed to make bread and beer, the 2 staples of the Egyptian diet. But they also grew flax for making linen cloth, onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, cucumbers, and melons. The third and final season was called Shemu, the season of harvest. Lasting from March to May, this was when all the hard work paid off. The crops grew tall under the Egyptian sun, nourished by the rich soil and irrigated by the elaborate system of canals the Egyptians had built. Harvest time was a busy period. Men, women, and children would all go into the fields to cut the grain, bundle it, and bring it to the threshing floors where it would be separated from the chaff. It was hot, exhausting work, but it was also a time of celebration because a good harvest meant another year of prosperity and survival. This cycle repeated year after year, century after century, with such regularity that the ancient Egyptians came to see it as proof of the divine order of the universe. The gods, they believed, ensured that the Nile would flood every year, and if the gods were happy, the flood would be just right, not too much, which would wash away villages and drown crops, not too little, which would mean famine and starvation, but just right, bringing exactly the amount of water and silt needed for a perfect growing season. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, famously called Egypt the gift of the Nile. He was absolutely right. Without the Nile, there would be no Egypt. The entire civilization, with all its wonders and achievements, existed only because of this river. Walk just a few miles away from the Nile in either direction, and you would find yourself in the desert, where nothing grows and life cannot survive for long. But along the river, life flourished in abundance. The Nile did not just provide water for crops, it was also the main highway of ancient Egypt. There were no paved roads in ancient times, no cars or trains. The fastest and easiest way to travel was by boat on the river. The current flowed north toward the Mediterranean Sea, so boats could simply float downstream. But the prevailing winds in Egypt blow from the north to the south, so boats travelling south could raise their sails and let the wind push them upstream. This made travel in both directions relatively easy and fast. Egyptians built many different types of boats. Small papyrus skiffs made from bundles of papyrus reeds tied together were used by fishermen and farmers to cross the river or navigate through the marshy areas near the riverbanks. These lightweight boats were easy to make and easy to maneuver, perfect for daily tasks like checking fish traps or gathering papyrus plants. Larger wooden boats, made from imported cedar wood from Lebanon or from acacia wood that grew in Egypt, were used to transport goods and people over longer distances. Some of these boats were enormous, capable of carrying huge blocks of stone weighing many tons, which were needed for building projects. The Nile was also full of life. Fish of many different species swam in its waters, providing an important source of protein for the Egyptian people. Fishermen would go out in their papyrus boats with nets made from papyrus reeds or flax fibers, casting them into the water and pulling them back full of fish. Archaeological evidence, including beautiful paintings on tomb walls, shows us exactly how these ancient fishermen worked. They used hand nets, seine nets that were dragged between two boats, and basket traps that were lowered into the water and left overnight. Catfish, perch, mullet, and tilapia were among the most commonly caught fish. The Egyptians had many ways of preparing fish. They ate it fresh, grilled over an open fire. They dried it in the sun to preserve it for later. They salted it and stored it in jars. Fish was so important to the Egyptian diet that some of the wages paid to workers were given in the form of fish. But the Nile was not just home to fish. Crocodiles basked on its muddy banks, their powerful jaws and armoured bodies making them one of the most feared predators in Egypt. Hippopotamuses, enormous and aggressive, wallowed in the river's waters and were considered extremely dangerous. Herons, ibises, and countless other birds waded through the shallow waters and nested in the papyrus thickets. Frogs filled the night air with their croaking songs. The river and its banks formed an entire ecosystem, teeming with life. This abundance of life along the Nile, contrasted with the barren desert just beyond it, made the ancient Egyptians see their river as truly magical. How else could you explain water flowing through the desert, bringing life where there should be none? How else could you explain the annual flood arriving at exactly the right time, year after year, for thousands of years? To the ancient Egyptians, the only explanation was that the Nile was divine. It was a gift from the gods, and it needed to be honoured, respected, and protected. And so, the Nile became central not just to Egyptian agriculture and transportation, but to Egyptian religion and mythology. The river was woven into the stories of their gods and goddesses. It played a starring role in their most important myths. It shaped how they understood the world and their place in it. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let yourself imagine standing on those ancient banks, feeling the breeze off the water, hearing the sounds of life all around you, and knowing that this river is the reason everything exists. Let that sense of deep connection to nature, to cycles that repeat with perfect regularity, to water that brings life, wash over you like the gentle flood of the Nile itself. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 2. Hapi, the god who made the river flow. Asterisk, asterisk. Now that we understand how important the Nile River was to ancient Egypt, let me ask you something. If you were an ancient Egyptian, living your entire life dependent on a river that flooded every year, would you not wonder why? Would you not ask yourself what caused the waters to rise with such perfect timing? Would you not want to thank whoever or whatever was responsible for this annual miracle that kept you and your family alive? The ancient Egyptians did wonder about these things, and their answer was Hapi. Hapi was the god of the annual flooding of the Nile, and he was one of the most important gods in ancient Egypt. even though he is not as famous today as gods like Ra or Osiris. But to the people who depended on the Nile flood for their survival, Hapi was absolutely crucial. He was the god who literally brought life to Egypt every single year. Hapi was depicted in a unique way that set him apart from other Egyptian gods. He was shown as a man with a large, round belly and breasts, symbolizing abundance and nourishment. His skin was often painted blue or green, representing the waters of the Nile and the vegetation that grew along its banks. On his head, he wore a headdress made of papyrus plants and lotus flowers, the two most important plants that grew in and around the Nile. He was often shown carrying offering trays loaded with fish, birds, and plants, all gifts from the river. The ancient Egyptians believed that Hapi lived in caves near the first cataract of the Nile, the place where the river entered Egypt from the south, near the modern city of Aswan. These caves, they thought, were the source of the Nile's power. Every year, when it was time for the flood to begin, Hapi would pour water from his jars, causing the river to swell and overflow its banks. The more generous Hapi was with his water, the better the flood would be, and the better the harvest that followed. Prayers and hymns to Hapi have survived on ancient papyri and carved on temple walls, and they give us a beautiful window into how the Egyptians viewed this god. One famous hymn, dating back over 3,000 years, calls Hapi the Lord of the fishes and birds of the marshes, the creator of grain and barley, who makes the temples festive, and who brings offerings to every god. The hymn describes how when Hapi rises, the land rejoices, and every stomach is filled with happiness. When he is sluggish, people are poor and have no food to eat. These were not just pretty words. They reflected a real and present fear in the hearts of ancient Egyptians. If the flood was too low, meaning Hapi had been stingy with his waters, the crops would fail and famine would follow. Historical records tell us of years when the Nile flood was insufficient and terrible famines resulted, with people starving and social order breaking down. On the other hand, if the flood was too high, meaning Hapi had been too generous, the villages could be washed away, and the destruction could also lead to hardship. The perfect flood, the one that brought just the right amount of water and silt, was a blessing that the Egyptians never took for granted. They prayed for it, made offerings for it, and thanked Hapi when it arrived. The ancient Egyptian state kept careful records of the flood levels using devices called nilometers, which were essentially measuring sticks or stairs built into the riverbank that showed exactly how high the water had risen. These measurements were vitally important because they allowed officials to predict how good the harvest would be and to plan accordingly. But Hapi was more than just the god of flooding. He represented the abundance and fertility that the Nile brought to Egypt. He was seen as a giver of life, a provider of food, and a symbol of everything that was good and nourishing. In artistic representations, Hapi was often shown in pairs, representing the two parts of Egypt. One Hapi represented Upper Egypt in the south, wearing a papyrus plant headdress. The other represented Lower Egypt in the north, wearing a lotus flower headdress. Together, these two aspects of Hapi showed that the god's blessings extended to the entire length of the Nile Valley. Interestingly, despite his importance, Hapi did not have major temples dedicated solely to him like some other Egyptian gods did. This was because Hapi was not a god you went to a temple to worship. He was the river itself. Every time you drew water from the Nile, you were taking from Hapi's abundance. Every time you caught a fish or planted a seed in the flood-enriched soil, you were benefiting from Hapi's generosity. The river was his temple, and the entire land of Egypt was his domain. However, Hapi was honored in many temples throughout Egypt, usually in connection with the pharaoh or with other gods. Carvings show pharaohs making offerings to Hapi, asking for his blessing on their kingdom. The pharaoh's role included ensuring that the gods were properly honored so that they would continue to bless Egypt with prosperity. The most important god for this prosperity was Hapi, because without the flood, nothing else mattered. There was also an interesting theological connection between Hapi and other major gods. Over time, Hapi became associated with Osiris, the god of the underworld and resurrection. This connection made sense to the Egyptians because both gods were associated with cycles. Osiris represented the cycle of death and rebirth, while Hapi represented the cycle of drought and flood. Some texts even suggest that the Egyptians believed the Nile flood was caused by the tears of Isis, the wife of Osiris, crying for her murdered husband. When Isis wept in grief, her tears fed the Nile and caused it to overflow. This beautiful and sad image connected the most important myth in Egyptian religion, the story of Osiris and Isis, directly to the most important natural event of the year, the Nile flood. Another god connected to the Nile was Khnum, the ram-headed god who was believed to control the Nile's flow from his sanctuary at the first cataract. The Egyptians believed that Khnum literally guarded the source of the Nile at Elephantine Island near Aswan, and that he decided how much water would flow north into Egypt each year. Working together, Khnum and Hapi ensured that the Nile would bring life to Egypt. As you lie here now, comfortable and relaxed, think about what it would be like to see a god in something as simple as a river. Not an invisible, distant god, but one whose presence you could see and feel every single day. The ancient Egyptians saw Hapi in every cup of water they drank, in every fish they caught, in every plant that grew. They saw him in the life-giving mud that covered their fields each year. They felt his presence as they bathed in the river on a hot day, or as they sailed on his waters. Their God was not abstract or theoretical. He was as real and present as the water itself. This deep spiritual connection to the natural world is something that many of us have lost in modern times. We turn on a faucet and water appears, but we rarely think about where it comes from or how it got there. We buy our food in stores, but we rarely think about the soil and water that grew it. The ancient Egyptians could not take these things for granted. They knew, intimately and personally, that their lives depended on the Nile, and so they honored it not just as a river, but as a god. Tonight, as you rest, let yourself feel that same gratitude that the ancient Egyptians felt when they saw the Nile waters rising, bringing life to their land. Feel thankful for the water that sustains you, for the earth that grows your food, for the natural cycles that continue even when we forget to notice them. Let the spirit of Hapi, the generous God with his overflowing jars, pour peace and abundance into your dreams. Feel the gentle rising of life-giving waters, not as a flood that destroys, but as a blessing that renews. Let that feeling of renewal wash through you, carrying away stress and worry, leaving only peace and rest in its place. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 3. The Sacred Crocodile God. Sobek, asterisk, asterisk. Have you ever wondered what ancient people thought when they saw a crocodile? These massive reptiles, with their powerful jaws filled with sharp teeth, their armoured bodies, and their ability to move with explosive speed when hunting. must have been both terrifying and fascinating to the ancient Egyptians who lived along the Nile. Unlike us, who might only see a crocodile safely behind glass in a zoo, the ancient Egyptians encountered these creatures regularly. And rather than simply fearing them, they did something interesting. They made one of them into a god. Let me tell you about Sobek, the crocodile god of the Nile. Sobek was one of the oldest gods in the Egyptian pantheon, worshipped from the earliest times of Egyptian civilization all the way through to the Roman period. He was depicted either as a full crocodile or as a man with the head of a crocodile, often wearing a headdress with feathers, horns, and a sun disk that showed his power and importance. Sobek was associated with the Nile River itself, particularly with the parts of the river where crocodiles lived. He was considered a god of water, but also of fertility, military prowess, and protection. This might seem strange at first. How can a dangerous predator be a god of protection? But if you think about it from the ancient Egyptian perspective, it makes perfect sense. The crocodile was powerful and dangerous, yes, but that power could be directed. If you honored the crocodile, if you respected it and made offerings to it, then perhaps that power would protect you rather than harm you. The ancient Egyptians believed that Sobek's sweat created the Nile River itself. Imagine that. Every drop of water in the entire river came from this god. Some myths said that Sobek emerged from the dark waters of chaos at the beginning of time and helped create the world. He was present at the birth of Ra, the sun god, and helped the sun rise each day. In some versions of Egyptian mythology, Sobek was even credited with catching the 4 sons of Horus in a net when they emerged from the waters in the form of lotus flowers, an act that helped establish order in the universe. But beyond the grand cosmic myths, Sobek played a practical role in the daily religious life of ancient Egyptians, especially those who lived in areas where crocodiles were common. The Fayum region, a large oasis fed by a branch of the Nile west of the main river valley, was particularly associated with Sobek worship. This area had a large lake that was full of crocodiles, and the people there built temples to Sobek and kept sacred crocodiles that they believed were living incarnations of the god. One of the most famous temples dedicated to Sobek still stands today at a place called Kom Ombo, located on the banks of the Nile about 30 miles north of Aswan. The temple of Kom Ombo is unique because it is actually 2 temples in one, a double temple dedicated to 2 gods. One half is dedicated to Sobek and the other half to Horus, the falcon-headed god. The temple sits right on the riverbank, in a location where crocodiles were once common, and it was built during the Ptolemaic period, between 180 and 47 BCE, though it was likely built on the site of an earlier temple. Walking through the Temple of Kom Ombo must have been an amazing experience in ancient times. The temple is symmetrical, with 2 of everything: 2 entrances, 2 halls, 2 sanctuaries. One side for Sobek, one side for Horus. The walls are covered with beautiful carvings, showing the pharaoh making offerings to the gods, showing Sobek in his crocodile form receiving prayers and gifts. There are also fascinating carvings showing surgical instruments, a calendar, and other aspects of ancient Egyptian knowledge. Next to the temple, archaeologists have found a crocodile cemetery and have created a small museum displaying some of the mummified crocodiles that were found there. Yes, mummified crocodiles. The ancient Egyptians did not just mummify humans, they also mummified animals that were sacred to their gods. Crocodiles were caught and brought to the temple, where they lived in special pools and were fed the best food, treated with honor and respect. When these sacred crocodiles died, they were carefully mummified, using the same techniques used for humans, wrapped in linen bandages and buried in special tombs. Pilgrims would donate mummified crocodiles to the temple as offerings to Sobek, hoping to gain the god's favor and protection. Archaeological evidence shows that these sacred crocodiles were well cared for during their lives. Studies of mummified crocodile remains show that they were fed regularly and did not suffer from malnutrition or disease. Some of these mummified crocodiles were quite large, measuring over 15 feet long, showing that they had lived for many years under the care of the priests. But why did the Egyptians go to such lengths to honor and worship a dangerous predator? The answer lies in their understanding of the natural world. The ancient Egyptians saw the Nile as full of both blessings and dangers. The river gave them water, fish, and fertile soil, but it could also take life. People drowned in the river, crocodiles attacked fishermen, and anyone who ventured too close to the water's edge. By honoring Sobek, by making him a god and giving him offerings, the Egyptians were trying to make peace with this dangerous aspect of the river they depended on. There was a saying in ancient Egypt, captured in one of the magical texts that have survived. It went something like this: I am the crocodile that seizes with violence. I am the great fish in the city of Kememet. I am the Lord, to whom bowing and prostration are made in the city of Letopolis. These words were meant to be recited as a protective spell, aligning the speaker with Sobek's power and thus gaining protection from harm. Sobek was also associated with the pharaoh's power and authority. The fierce, primal strength of the crocodile was seen as a quality that a good king should have. Several pharaohs took names that incorporated Sobek's name, such as Sobek-hotep, meaning Sobek is satisfied. These rulers were declaring their connection to the god's power and asking for his blessing on their reign. In artwork and hieroglyphic inscriptions, Sobek is often shown with a small human figure in his mouth, but not in a threatening way. This image represented the god's power to both give and take life, to both threaten and protect. It was a reminder that the forces of nature were not to be trifled with, that respect and proper worship were necessary to maintain balance and safety. Interestingly, the worship of Sobek continued long after many other ancient Egyptian religious practices had faded away. Even during the Greek and Roman periods, when Egypt was ruled by foreign powers and many traditional beliefs were changing, people still came to temples like Kom Ombo to worship Sobek and to seek his protection. The crocodile remained a powerful symbol, even as the world around it changed. As you relax now, think about the ancient Egyptians who lived along the Nile, knowing that somewhere in those waters, powerful predators lurked. Imagine them making offerings at Sobek's temple, asking for protection for themselves and their families. Think about the priests who cared for sacred crocodiles, feeding them and honoring them as living gods. Consider how they took something frightening and dangerous and transformed it through worship into something that could provide comfort and protection. This is a deep wisdom that we can still learn from today. The things we fear most can sometimes become our greatest protectors if we learn to understand them and respect them. The ancient Egyptians did not try to eliminate all the crocodiles from the Nile, even though they could have. Instead, they found a way to live with them, to honor them, and to incorporate them into their spiritual understanding of the world. This kind of balance with nature, this ability to see divinity even in dangerous creatures, is something we could benefit from remembering. Let the image of Sobek, the powerful crocodile god, remind you that strength and protection come from respecting the world around us, from finding balance rather than trying to conquer and control. As you drift deeper into relaxation, feel that sense of being protected, of being safe, just as the ancient Egyptians felt safe when they had honoured Sobek properly. Let any fears or worries drift away, carried off by the gentle current of the Nile, while the strong and vigilant presence of Sobek watches over your rest. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 4. The Beautiful Legend of Osiris and the Nile asterisk, asterisk. Now I want to share with you one of the most beautiful and important stories from ancient Egyptian mythology. A story that is deeply connected to the Nile River and explains not just the river's significance, but also the Egyptian understanding of death, rebirth, and the eternal cycles of nature. This is the legend of Osiris, and it is a story that was told and retold for thousands of years, a story that shaped Egyptian religion and culture more than perhaps any other myth. So settle in comfortably, let your breathing become slow and easy, and let me take you back to the very beginning of time, as the ancient Egyptians understood it. Long ago, when the gods still walked the earth, there was a king named Osiris. He was not a human king, but a god who had come down from the heavens to rule over Egypt and teach humanity how to live. Osiris was a good and wise king. He showed the ancient Egyptians how to grow crops, how to make bread and beer, how to build cities and live together in peace. Under his rule, Egypt prospered, and the people loved him deeply. Osiris was often depicted as a man with green skin, representing vegetation and fertility, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt and holding the crook and flail, symbols of kingship. Osiris was married to Isis, who was not only his wife but also his sister, as was common among the Egyptian gods. Isis was a goddess of magic, wisdom, and motherhood, and she was deeply devoted to Osiris. Together, they ruled Egypt in a golden age of peace and prosperity. But Osiris had a brother named Set, and Set was jealous. Set was the god of chaos, storms, and the desert, the dry lands beyond the green valley of the Nile. While Osiris represented order, fertility, and life, Set represented disorder, barrenness, and destruction. Set resented that Osiris was king, while he was not. He resented the love that the people had for Osiris. And so, driven by jealousy and ambition, Set hatched a plan to murder his brother and take the throne for himself. Set had a beautiful chest made, a magnificent box decorated with precious materials, sized exactly to fit Osiris's body, though Osiris did not know this. Set then held a great feast and invited Osiris and many other guests. During the feast, Set brought out the chest and announced that he would give it as a gift to whoever fit inside it perfectly. One by one, guests tried to fit inside the chest, but none of them matched its dimensions. Finally, Osiris, curious and unsuspecting, lay down inside the chest. He fit perfectly, of course, because Set had designed it that way. The moment Osiris was inside, Set and his conspirators slammed the lid shut and sealed it with molten lead. Osiris was trapped inside, unable to breathe or escape. Set and his helpers then took the chest and threw it into the Nile River, sending it floating away on the current. The good king Osiris drowned inside the sealed chest, murdered by his own brother. When Isis discovered what had happened, she was overcome with grief. But she did not give up. She was determined to find her husband's body and give him a proper burial. Isis travelled throughout Egypt and beyond, searching desperately for the chest. Her journey took her far from home, following rumours and clues, using her magic to help her in her search. Finally, Isis learned that the chest had floated down the Nile and out into the Mediterranean Sea, eventually washing ashore in a place called Byblos, in what is now Lebanon. There, a tamarisk tree had grown around the chest, enclosing it completely within its trunk. The king of Byblos, not knowing what was inside, had cut down this magnificent tree and used it as a pillar in his palace. Isis travelled to Byblos and, through cleverness and magic, convinced the king to give her the pillar. She split it open, retrieved the chest containing Osiris's body, and brought it back to Egypt. She hid the chest in the marshes of the Nile Delta, while she prepared the rituals needed to bring Osiris back to life. But Set discovered that Osiris's body had been returned to Egypt. Enraged, he found the chest, opened it, and to make sure Osiris could never be resurrected, he cut his brother's body into 14 pieces and scattered them throughout Egypt, throwing them into the Nile so they would be carried away by the current and lost forever. Once again, Isis's grief was overwhelming, but once again, her determination was stronger than her grief. With the help of her sister Nephthys and the god Anubis, who became the god of mummification, Isis searched the length and breadth of Egypt for the pieces of her husband's body. She travelled up and down the Nile, searching its banks and islands. One by one, she found 13 of the 14 pieces. The 14th piece, which according to some versions of the myth was Osiris's phallus, had been eaten by a fish and could not be recovered, so Isis fashioned a replacement using her magic. Once she had gathered all the pieces, Isis used her powerful magic to reassemble Osiris's body, binding the pieces together and performing rituals that would become the basis for Egyptian mummification practices for thousands of years to come. She wrapped his body in linen bandages, anointed it with oils and unguents, and spoke magical words that gave Osiris new life, though not life in this world. Osiris became the first mummy, and he was reborn not as a living king on earth, but as the king and judge of the underworld, the land of the dead. Before Osiris descended to his new kingdom in the underworld, Isis used her magic to conceive a child with him. This child was Horus, the falcon-headed god who would grow up to avenge his father and reclaim the throne of Egypt from Set. But that is another story. What matters for our purpose tonight is understanding how the Nile River is woven into this myth. You see, the ancient Egyptians connected this story directly to the annual flooding of the Nile. In one interpretation, the 14 pieces of Osiris's body that were scattered throughout Egypt represented the regions of Egypt that depended on the Nile's flood. Some sources say that wherever a piece of Osiris's body was found and buried, a temple was built, and these temples were scattered along the length of the Nile Valley. More importantly, the Egyptians believed that the annual flood of the Nile was caused by the tears of Isis, still weeping for her murdered husband even after he had been resurrected. Every year, when the time came for the flood, Isis would cry tears of sorrow and longing, and these tears would cause the Nile to swell and overflow its banks. The flood was thus not just a natural phenomenon or the work of Hapi pouring water from his jars. It was also an expression of divine love and grief, a reminder that life comes from death, that renewal comes from loss, that the cycles of nature are sacred and eternal. Osiris himself became associated with the Nile and with vegetation. His green skin represented the color of growing plants, nourished by the Nile's waters. When the crops grew tall in the fields after the flood, the Egyptians saw Osiris living again. When the crops were cut down at harvest, they saw Osiris dying again. But they knew he would be reborn the next year when the flood came and new crops were planted. This myth gave the ancient Egyptians a way to understand death that brought them great comfort. Just as Osiris died and was reborn, just as the Nile flooded and brought life after the dry season, just as crops were planted and grew and were harvested and planted again, so too would humans die and be reborn in the afterlife. Death was not an end, but a transformation, a journey from one form of existence to another. The Osiris myth became central to Egyptian funeral practices. When someone died, they hoped to become one with Osiris, to be resurrected in the afterlife just as he had been. The rituals that Isis performed on Osiris's body became the template for how all Egyptian mummies were prepared. Every person who could afford it was mummified, wrapped in linen like Osiris, provided with the things they would need in the afterlife, and laid to rest with prayers that they would join Osiris in his realm and live forever. The connection between Osiris and the Nile was so strong that some texts refer to the Nile itself as the efflux of Osiris, meaning that the river's waters were seen as coming from the god's resurrected body. The flood was his gift to Egypt, ensuring that the land would remain fertile and that life would continue. In this way, Osiris, Isis, Hapi, and the Nile itself were all part of one interconnected system of meaning that explained the world to the ancient Egyptians and gave them hope. As you lie here now, breathing slowly and deeply, think about the beautiful message at the heart of this story. Loss and grief are real, but they are not the end. From death comes new life. From sorrow comes healing. From the dry season comes the flood. From winter comes spring. The cycles continue, always. Nothing is truly lost. Everything is transformed and renewed. This was the great wisdom that the story of Osiris taught the ancient Egyptians, and it is wisdom that can bring us peace even today. Let yourself feel connected to these eternal cycles. Let the story of Isis's devotion, searching tirelessly for the one she loved, remind you that love endures beyond all obstacles. Let the image of Osiris, reborn and transformed into something eternal, remind you that change is not an ending, but a beginning. And let the gentle flow of the Nile, carrying these sacred stories through thousands of years to reach you here tonight, lull you into the deepest, most peaceful rest. The river flows on, as it always has, as it always will, carrying life and renewal in its gentle current. **, Chapter 5, Daily Life Along the Sacred River. **. Have you ever wondered what it would actually be like to live as an ordinary person in ancient Egypt, not as a pharaoh or a priest, but as a farmer, a fisherman, a baker, or a mother raising children? Let me paint you a picture of daily life along the Nile River, a picture based on archaeological evidence, ancient texts, and the beautiful scenes painted on tomb walls that have survived for thousands of years to tell us their stories. Close your eyes and imagine yourself there, living a simple life in harmony with the river that provides everything you need. The day begins early, as it always has for people who depend on the land and the water for their survival. The sun rises over the eastern desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and you wake to the sound of birds calling from the Papyrus 2 thickets along the river bank. The air is cool now in the early morning. though you know it will be hot by midday. You rise from your sleeping mat, a simple reed mat that you roll up and store during the day, in your small mud brick house. Your house is modest but comfortable. The walls are made of mud bricks, created by mixing Nile mud with straw and forming them in wooden moulds, then leaving them to dry in the sun. These bricks are excellent at keeping the house cool during the hot days and warm during the cooler nights. The roof is flat, made of wooden beams covered with mats and a layer of mud, and your family often sleeps on the roof during the hottest months to catch any breeze that might blow. There are small windows high on the walls to let in light while keeping out the harsh sun. The first task of the morning is to fetch water from the Nile. You take your ceramic water jug, beautifully formed though undecorated, and walk to the riverbank. This is a daily ritual performed by thousands of people all along the Nile. The river is busy, even this early. Fishermen are already out in their papyrus boats, checking the nets they set the night before. Women are washing clothes, beating them against rocks to get them clean. Children are playing in the shallow water, laughing and splashing each other. You fill your jug from the river, taking care to collect water from a spot where the current is strong and the water is clear. Everyone knows that drinking water from the still, stagnant areas can make you sick. The water is cool and fresh, and you take a moment to drink some directly from your cupped hands before filling your jug. You say a quick prayer to Hapi, thanking the god for his constant gift of water. Back at your house, you prepare breakfast. The ancient Egyptian diet was simple but nutritious. The staple foods were bread and beer. This might sound strange to us, but Egyptian beer was not like modern beer. It was thicker, more nutritious, and less alcoholic, more like liquid bread than like the beer we know today. Both bread and beer were made from wheat or barley, the grains that grew abundantly in the fields after the Nile flood each year. You take some bread left over from the previous day's baking and some onions and garlic. Fresh bread would be baked later in the day when the outdoor oven has been heated. For now, the day-old bread, softened by dipping it in beer, along with the sharp taste of onions and garlic, makes a satisfying breakfast. If you were wealthy, you might have honey to sweeten your bread, or dates and figs, or even some meat or fish. But most ordinary Egyptians ate meat only occasionally, reserving it for festivals and special occasions. After breakfast, the work of the day begins. If you are a farmer during the growing season of Peret, you head out to your field. Ancient Egyptian fields were organized in a system of basins, areas of land surrounded by low mud walls that could be flooded with water from irrigation canals. These canals connected to the Nile, allowing farmers to direct water to their fields even after the annual flood had receded. Working in the field is hard labor, but it has its own rhythm and satisfaction. You might be plowing, walking behind a wooden plow pulled by cattle, breaking up the soil to prepare it for planting. Or you might be hoeing, using a simple hoe to break up clods of earth and remove weeds. Or during harvest time, you might be cutting grain with a wooden sickle edged with sharp flints, bundling the grain and carrying it to the threshing floor where cattle will walk over it to separate the grain from the chaff. As you work, you are not alone. Your neighbours work in the fields nearby, and often you sing work songs to keep rhythm and make the labour less tedious. Archaeological evidence shows that Egyptians had many such songs preserved in hieroglyphic texts. One work song, recorded on a tomb wall, goes something like this: "The earth is content under your hands. You make green shoots grow. You fill the granaries. You give bread to those who have none." The songs praised the gods, told stories and helped the workers coordinate their efforts. If you are a fisherman instead of a farmer, your work takes you out onto the water itself. You rise before dawn and paddle your small papyrus skiff out onto the Nile, where you cast your nets or check your traps. The papyrus boat is lightweight and easy to maneuver, perfect for navigating through the shallow marshes where fish are plentiful. The construction of these boats was a skill passed down through generations. Bundles of papyrus stems were gathered and bound together tightly, shaped into a boat form with upturned ends, and sealed with pitch to make them more waterproof. Fishing was not just work, it was also a spiritual activity. The Egyptians saw the Nile and its creatures as sacred, and fishermen often said prayers before casting their nets, asking permission from the gods and thanking them for their bounty. The fish themselves were often associated with various gods. Some species of fish were sacred to certain gods and were not eaten in regions where those gods were particularly worshipped, though they might be eaten in other regions. You pull your net from the water, and it is heavy with fish, catfish, perch, tilapia, their scales glinting in the early morning sun. This is a good catch, enough to feed your family and to sell or trade for other goods you need. You sort through the fish, keeping the good ones and throwing back any that are too small or of a sacred species that should not be caught. As the morning wears on and the sun climbs higher, the heat increases. During the middle of the day, when the sun is at its fiercest, work often stops. This is the time to rest in the shade, to eat the midday meal, to nap if possible. Children who have been helping with light tasks in the morning now have time to play. They make toys from whatever materials are at hand, clay figures of animals, boats made from reeds, balls made from papyrus and leather. Afternoon brings more work, but also more social interaction. Women gather to bake bread together, sharing the large outdoor ovens that serve several families. They grind grain using stone querns, mix the flour with water to make dough, shape the dough into loaves, and bake them in the hot oven. The smell of fresh bread baking is wonderful, and it draws children from all around hoping for a warm piece fresh from the oven. Other women work at weaving, creating linen cloth from the flax that grows in the fields. Egyptian linen was famous throughout the ancient world for its quality. Women would spin the flax fibres into thread using simple drop spindles, then weave the thread into cloth on horizontal looms. This cloth would be used to make clothes, sheets, and the wrappings used for mummification. Men who are not working in the fields or fishing might be doing other work. Some are craftsmen, making pottery, tools, furniture, or jewellery. Others work on maintaining the irrigation canals and dikes, crucial work that must be done regularly to ensure the water management system continues to function. Some work on building projects, either for the state, constructing temples and monuments, or for private individuals, building houses and tombs. As evening approaches, the heat begins to lessen, and life along the Nile becomes even more pleasant. This is when people come down to the river to bathe, washing away the dirt and sweat of the day. Ancient Egyptians valued cleanliness highly. The river provided unlimited water for washing, and people bathed frequently. Wealthy people used natron, a naturally occurring salt, as a kind of soap, while ordinary people simply scrubbed with water and sand. The evening meal is prepared as the sun begins to set. This meal is usually more substantial than breakfast, with fresh bread, vegetables, and if fortune has smiled on the family that day, fish or even a small amount of meat. Families eat together, sitting on mats on the floor or on the roof where it is cooler, talking about the day's events telling stories, and enjoying each other's company. As darkness falls, lamps are lit. These are simple oil lamps, ceramic bowls filled with oil with a wick made from twisted flax. They do not give much light, but they are enough to see by. People sit outside in the evening air, still warm but no longer uncomfortable, and they talk and laugh with their neighbours. Children listen to stories told by the elders, tales of gods and heroes, of pharaohs and great deeds, of the Nile and its mysteries. And then, as the night deepens and the stars come out in their countless thousands, so much brighter than we can see them today with our electric lights, people retire to their sleeping mats. Tomorrow will bring another day of work, another day of living in rhythm with the Nile's seasons, another day in the endless cycle that has continued for generation after generation. This was the life of ordinary people in ancient Egypt. Hard work, yes, but also community, family, stories, and a deep connection to the river that made all of it possible. They lived simply, but not poorly. They worked hard, but not without joy. They were part of something larger than themselves, part of the great cycle of the Nile and the seasons, part of a civilization that would endure for thousands of years. As you rest now, let yourself feel that same simple contentment that an ancient Egyptian might have felt at the end of a good day. The work is done. Your family is fed. The Nile continues to flow, ensuring that tomorrow will bring new opportunities and new blessings. Let that feeling of being part of the natural rhythms of life settle over you like a comfortable blanket. Let the gentle sounds of the river, the murmur of water, the calls of birds, the distant voices of neighbours lull you into peaceful, restful sleep. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 6. The Papyrus Plant and the Gifts of the Marsh. Asterisk, asterisk. There was a plant that grew along the banks of the Nile that was so useful, so important to ancient Egyptian civilization, that it became a symbol of Lower Egypt itself, and appeared in countless artistic representations and religious images. This plant was the papyrus. And tonight I want to tell you about how this remarkable plant shaped Egyptian life in ways both practical and spiritual. Let your mind drift along with me into the marshy areas near the Nile, where the water is shallow and still, where these tall green plants grow in dense thickets, rustling gently in the breeze. The papyrus plant, Cyperus papyrus in scientific terms, is a tall reed that can grow up to 15 feet high. It has a triangular green stem topped with a crown of thin, thread-like leaves that spray out in all directions like a feathery umbrella or a firework frozen in mid-burst. These plants grew abundantly in the marshes and slow-moving waters along the Nile, creating vast thickets that were home to countless birds, fish, and other creatures. For the ancient Egyptians, the papyrus marshes were places of great abundance and also of mystery. They were hunting and fishing grounds where people could find food. They were also dangerous places where hippopotamuses and crocodiles lurked, where a person could easily get lost among the tall reeds, where the boundary between the ordered world of human civilization and the wild world of nature became blurred. But most importantly, the papyrus plant itself was incredibly useful. The ancient Egyptians found more uses for this single plant than seems almost possible. Let me tell you about some of them, and as I do, imagine yourself as an ancient Egyptian walking among these tall green reeds, seeing them not just as plants but as gifts from the gods, as solutions to countless practical problems. The most famous use of papyrus was to make writing material, the paper-like sheets that we still call papyrus today. The process of making papyrus sheets was intricate and required skill. First, the green outer rind of the papyrus stem was removed, exposing the white pith inside. This pith was cut into thin strips. These strips were laid side by side on a flat surface, all running in the same direction. Then another layer of strips was placed on top, running perpendicular to the first layer. The strips were then beaten with a mallet, which caused the plant's natural juices to act as glue, binding the layers together. Finally, the sheet was pressed and dried in the sun. The resulting sheets of papyrus were light-coloured, smooth, and excellent for writing on. Scribes used brushes made from reeds, dipped in ink made from soot and water for black ink, or from red ochre for red ink, to write hieroglyphs and hieratic script on these sheets. Multiple sheets could be glued together side by side to create long scrolls. Some papyrus scrolls found by archaeologists are over 30 feet long, containing entire books or administrative records. Papyrus was so important that it became Egypt's major export to other civilizations. The ancient Greeks and Romans imported vast quantities of Egyptian papyrus for their own writing needs. The word paper itself comes from papyrus, showing just how important this Egyptian invention was to human civilization. But papyrus was used for so much more than writing. Remember those small boats I mentioned that fishermen used? They were made from bundles of papyrus stems tied tightly together. These boats were light enough to be carried easily, yet sturdy enough to use for fishing and for travelling across the river. Archaeological evidence and ancient artistic representations show us exactly how these boats were constructed. The papyrus stems were gathered when they were still green and flexible, bundled together into thick ropes, and then shaped into boat form with the ends tied up to curve out of the water. Larger boats could carry several people, while small ones were just right for one person. The papyrus plant was also used to make rope, sandals, baskets, mats, and even light building materials. The stems could be woven into baskets for carrying goods or storing grain. The fibres could be twisted into strong rope for tying things together, for mooring boats, for countless purposes where cord was needed. Mats woven from papyrus were used as sleeping mats, as covers for roofs, as screens for doorways. Sandals, made from papyrus, were common footwear for ordinary people, woven in simple but effective patterns that protected the feet from hot sand and sharp stones. The roots of the papyrus plant were edible. Poor people, especially, would eat papyrus roots either raw or cooked. They were also used medicinally. Ancient Egyptian medical papyri, which are some of our most valuable sources for understanding ancient medicine, mention papyrus in various remedies. The ashes of burned papyrus were used in ointments for wounds. The pith was used in poultices for inflammation. Even the symbolic importance of papyrus cannot be overstated. In ancient Egyptian art and hieroglyphs, the papyrus plant represented Lower Egypt, the northern delta region where papyrus grew most abundantly. The hieroglyph for papyrus was used to write the word wodge, meaning green, fresh, and flourishing. One of the most common symbols in Egyptian art shows papyrus and lotus plants intertwined, representing the union of Lower and Upper Egypt, the two regions that together formed the unified kingdom. Papyrus appeared in religious contexts constantly. The papyrus thicket was seen as a place of protection and renewal. In Egyptian mythology, when the goddess Isis was hiding the infant Horus from his evil uncle Set, she hid him in the papyrus marshes of the delta, where Set could not find him. The papyrus protected the young god until he was old enough to reclaim his father's throne. Columns in Egyptian temples were often carved to look like papyrus plants. These columns, called papyriform columns, have shafts that look like bundled papyrus stems and capitals that spread out like the umbel of papyrus leaves at the top. Walking through a temple with these columns must have felt like walking through a sacred forest of giant papyrus plants, with the stone columns creating the same sense of awe and mystery that the real marshes inspired. The papyrus marshes were also prime hunting grounds for the wealthy. Tomb paintings often show nobles hunting birds in the papyrus thickets, throwing curved throwing sticks at the flocks of ducks and geese that lived among the reeds. These hunting scenes were not just depictions of sport. They had symbolic meaning related to maintaining order and defeating chaos, represented by the wild birds being brought down by the hunter's skill. In the marshes, people could also gather wild foods. In addition to the papyrus roots, the marshes provided lotus flowers whose seeds and roots were also edible, as well as wild celery, water lilies, and other marsh plants. The marshes were full of fish, especially in the shallow areas where the big predators of the main river could not reach. They were full of birds whose eggs could be collected and eaten. They were, in short, an abundant natural grocery store for those who knew how to use them. Sadly, papyrus no longer grows wild in Egypt. Changes in the river's flow, particularly after the construction of modern dams, have eliminated the marshy conditions that papyrus needs to thrive. Today, wild papyrus is found in other parts of Africa, but the papyrus marshes of ancient Egypt are gone, existing now only in ancient texts, artistic representations, and in our imagination. But imagine those marshes in their prime. Imagine acres and acres of tall green papyrus plants, their feathery tops waving in the breeze, creating a rustling sound like whispered conversations. Imagine the air filled with the calls of countless birds, herons, ibises, ducks, geese, and dozens of other species. Imagine the splash of fish jumping, the buzz of insects, the deep grunt of a hidden hippopotamus. Imagine people moving carefully through this green world, harvesting papyrus stems, checking fish traps, hunting for birds, always watchful for danger, but grateful for abundance. This was part of the Nile's gift to ancient Egypt. Not just the river itself, but the ecosystem that surrounded it, the rich marsh environment where papyrus and many other useful plants grew. The Nile created these marshes through its annual flood, and the marshes in turn provided resources that were essential to Egyptian civilization. As you lie here tonight, think about how the ancient Egyptians saw possibility and usefulness in the simple plants that grew along their river. They did not take nature's gifts for granted. They found ways to use every part of the papyrus plant, wasting nothing, respecting everything. They saw the divine in the everyday, the sacred in the practical. Let yourself feel gratitude for the simple things that sustain us, the plants and water and soil that make life possible. Let the image of the gentle papyrus marshes, rustling peacefully in the breeze, calm your mind and settle your thoughts. Imagine yourself floating on a small papyrus boat, drifting slowly through these ancient marshes, surrounded by green and growth and the quiet sounds of nature. Feel safe, protected, supported by these strong stems that the ancient Egyptians trusted enough to float upon. Let that trust, that feeling of being held and supported, carry you gently into deep, peaceful sleep. ***, Chapter 7, Festivals and Celebrations on the Nile. ***, Asterisk. Life in ancient Egypt was not all hard work and worry about the flood. The ancient Egyptians knew how to celebrate, how to enjoy life, how to honor their gods with festivals that brought joy and community together. Let me tell you about some of these celebrations, especially those connected to the Nile River, and let the images of feasting, music, and happiness fill your mind as you relax more and more deeply. One of the most important festivals in ancient Egypt was the Opet festival, celebrated at Thebes, the great city that is now known as Luxor. The Opet festival lasted for nearly a month during the season of Akhet, when the Nile was in flood and farming work had stopped. This timing was perfect because people had time to celebrate and participate in religious rituals without neglecting their fields. The highlight of the Opet festival was a grand procession that carried the sacred statues of the gods Amun, Mut, and Khonsu from the great Karnak temple to the Luxor temple, a distance of about 2 miles. But this was not a simple walk. The statues, hidden in special shrines, were placed on ceremonial boats called barkis and carried by priests on their shoulders. These boats were elaborate, decorated with gold and jewels, with prows and sterns carved to look like the heads of sacred animals. The procession moved slowly through streets lined with people cheering and celebrating. Musicians played drums, flutes, and sistrums, a kind of rattle sacred to the goddess Hathor. Dancers performed, moving rhythmically to the music. Singers chanted hymns praising the gods. The air was filled with the smoke of incense, burning to purify the path and please the gods. People threw flowers and offered prayers as the divine barks passed by. But in some years, the procession took an even more impressive form. The divine barques were placed on actual boats and sailed down the Nile from Karnak to Luxor. Imagine seeing this sight. Decorated boats carrying the shrines of the gods, surrounded by dozens of other boats filled with priests, officials, musicians and dancers, all sailing together down the river. People lined the riverbanks to watch and cheer. Smaller boats crowded the water, everyone wanting to be close to the gods as they made their journey. When the procession reached Luxor Temple, there were more rituals and celebrations. The pharaoh himself participated, performing ceremonies that reinforced his divine right to rule and his connection to the gods. There were offerings of food and drink, not just for the gods but also for the people. The temples distributed bread, beer, and meat to the crowds, and everyone feasted together. For many ordinary people, this might have been one of the few times in the year when they ate meat and drank more than their usual ration of beer. Another important celebration connected to the Nile was the Festival of the Nile Inundation, celebrating the beginning of the flood season. This festival occurred in midsummer, right when the Nile waters were beginning to rise. It was a time of hope and prayer, asking the gods to send a good flood, not too high and not too low. People made offerings to Hapi, the god of the flood, throwing gifts into the river as prayers for prosperity. These offerings might include food, flowers, small statues, or other precious items. The offerings were not seen as lost when they sank into the water. They were gifts to the god, and giving them brought the promise of divine favour in return. This festival also included the tradition of throwing a virgin bride into the Nile as a sacrifice. However, before you feel too horrified, let me clarify that by the historical period we have good records for, this was not an actual human sacrifice. Instead, a doll or statue was dressed as a bride and ceremonially thrown into the river. This ritual echoed much older traditions from prehistoric times, but had evolved into a symbolic rather than literal sacrifice. During this festival, People would gather at the riverbanks for celebrations that lasted several days. There was music and dancing, feasting and drinking. Boats decorated with flowers and streamers filled the river. People threw flower petals and lotus blossoms into the water. Young people played games, running races, and competing in tests of strength and skill. The atmosphere was one of joy and hope, everyone praying that this year's flood would be blessed by the gods. The beautiful festival of the valley was another major celebration, this one focusing on the connection between the living and the dead, and it too involved a procession across the Nile. The sacred statue of Amun was carried from Karnak Temple, placed on a boat, and sailed across the Nile to the west bank, where many of the tombs and mortuary temples were located. The west bank was associated with the land of the dead because that is where the sun set each day, symbolically dying before being reborn in the east the next morning. Families would visit the tombs of their ancestors during this festival, bringing offerings of food and drink. They would have picnics at the tombs, eating and drinking in the company of their deceased loved ones, believing that the spirits of the dead would join them and partake of the offering's spiritual essence. This was not a sad or somber occasion. It was celebratory, a time to remember the dead with love and joy, to maintain the connection between the living and the ancestors, to reaffirm family bonds that death could not break. Can you imagine such a celebration? Families sitting in the cool shadows of tomb chapels, eating bread and onions and drinking beer, telling stories about grandparents and great-grandparents who had died long ago, keeping their memories alive. Children learning about their family history, hearing tales of ancestors' accomplishments and adventures. Musicians playing gentle music while the sun set over the Nile, painting the sky in brilliant colours. The river, always the river, flowing peacefully below, connecting the land of the living with the land of the dead, connecting past and present and future. There were also smaller, more local festivals throughout the year. When the crops were successfully harvested, communities would hold celebration feasts, thanking the gods for their bounty and sharing the first fruits of the harvest with neighbours and with the temple. When a new temple or monument was completed, there would be dedication ceremonies with processions and offerings. When a pharaoh celebrated a jubilee marking 30 years of reign, the celebrations were enormous, lasting for days, and including people from all over Egypt. Music and dance were essential parts of all these celebrations. The ancient Egyptians loved music. They played harps, lutes, drums, flutes, and cymbals. They sang songs, some religious and some secular. Archaeological evidence, including paintings on tomb walls and actual instruments found in excavations, shows us that music was sophisticated and important in Egyptian culture. Dancing was also highly valued. Professional dancers performed at temples and festivals, but ordinary people also danced for joy at celebrations. Tomb paintings show dancers moving with grace and energy, sometimes doing acrobatic moves like backbends and high kicks. The dances had meaning, telling stories or honouring the gods, but they were also simply expressions of joy and celebration. Wine and beer flowed freely at these festivals. The ancient Egyptians enjoyed getting drunk at celebrations, though excessive drunkenness was considered bad behaviour in daily life. The goddess Hathor was associated with intoxication and joy, and getting drunk during her festivals was seen as a form of worship, a way of experiencing divine ecstasy. Beer was the everyday drink, but wine, made from grapes grown in the Nile Delta and in oases, was reserved for special occasions and was a sign of abundance and celebration. These festivals served important social functions beyond just being fun. They brought communities together, reinforcing social bonds and shared identity. They marked the passage of time and the changing seasons. They allowed people to step outside the routine of daily work and remember the bigger meanings of life, the presence of the gods, the connection to ancestors, the bonds of family and community. They gave people hope, especially festivals like the Nile inundation celebration, reminding everyone that the gods were watching over them and that the cycles of nature would continue to bring renewal and abundance. As you rest here tonight, let yourself imagine being part of one of these ancient celebrations. You are standing on the banks of the Nile, watching beautiful boats sail past carrying the shrines of gods. You hear music filling the air, drums keeping a steady rhythm that matches your heartbeat, flutes playing melodies that seem to float on the breeze like the petals being thrown into the water. You taste fresh bread and honey, beer sweet and nourishing, grapes that burst with juice in your mouth. You feel the joy of community around you, hundreds or thousands of people all celebrating together, all connected by shared belief and shared purpose. Let that feeling of celebration and joy, of being part of something larger than yourself, of being surrounded by beauty and music and love, fill you completely. Let it wash away any loneliness or isolation you might feel. Let it remind you that humans have always gathered together to celebrate life, to honor what is sacred, to find joy even in difficult times. The ancient Egyptians understood this deeply, and they left us the gift of their festivals and their joy, captured in stone carvings and paintings that still smile at us across thousands of years. Rest in that joy now. Let the music play gently in your imagination. Let the river flow peacefully through your dreams. Let yourself be part of the eternal celebration of life that the Nile has hosted for so many thousands of years. Be at peace. Be joyful. Be gently carried into the deepest, most restful sleep. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 8. Building the Pyramids by the Nile. Asterisk, asterisk. Have you ever looked at pictures of the Great Pyramids of Egypt and wondered how they were built? How did ancient people, with no modern machinery, no trucks or cranes, manage to move millions of massive stone blocks and stack them into perfect geometric shapes that have stood for over 4,000 years? The answer, like so many things in ancient Egypt, comes back to the Nile River. Let me tell you the story of how the river helped build the most famous monuments in the world, and as I do, let yourself drift deeper into relaxation, imagining the slow, steady work that created these eternal wonders. The pyramids were built during the Old Kingdom period of ancient Egypt, mostly during the 4th dynasty, around 2600 to 2500 BCE. The most famous pyramids are at Giza, near modern Cairo, but there are actually over 100 pyramids scattered along the Nile Valley. Each one was built as a tomb for a pharaoh, a final resting place from which the king could ascend to join the gods in the afterlife. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, also known as Cheops, is the largest of the Giza pyramids. It originally stood over 480 feet tall and was made from approximately 2,300,000 limestone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons. Some of the granite blocks used in the inner chambers weigh as much as 80 tons. Moving and placing these massive stones was an enormous challenge that required clever planning and the full resources of the Egyptian state. But here is where the Nile becomes crucial to the story. Recent archaeological and geological research has revealed that when the pyramids were built, the Nile had a branch that flowed much closer to the pyramid sites than the main river does today. This ancient branch of the Nile, which no longer exists, would have brought water to within a short distance of the Giza Plateau. The Egyptians created harbours and canals connecting the river to the construction sites, allowing them to transport the heavy stone blocks by boat for most of their journey. Imagine the scene during the flood season, during Akhet, when the Nile's waters were high. Limestone blocks, quarried from sites south of Cairo and from the Tura quarries across the river, were loaded onto large wooden barges. These barges were specially designed to carry enormous weight, with flat bottoms and sturdy construction. The blocks were carefully placed on the barges and tied down securely. Then, using the river's current and the wind in their sails, the boats would transport the stones to the harbour near the pyramid construction site. The granite blocks, used for the inner chambers, and some of the casing stones, came from even farther away. They were quarried at Aswan, over 500 miles south of Giza. These massive blocks were loaded onto boats and floated down the Nile, a journey that could take weeks but was far easier than trying to transport such weight overland. The Nile made this long-distance transportation possible. Without the river, the pyramids could never have been built. During the flood season, when farming was impossible because the fields were underwater, the farmers became construction workers. This was not forced labour in the way we might imagine slavery. Archaeological evidence, including workers' villages and the remains of meals provided to the workers, shows that pyramid building was a national project that Egyptians took pride in. Workers were fed well, given bread, beer, meat, and vegetables. They were housed in specially built villages near the construction sites. They were organised into teams with names that showed their pride in their work, names like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkaure. These teams worked in rotating shifts, perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 workers at a time. Though the exact numbers are still debated by scholars, they would work for a few months during the flood season, then return to their farms when it was time to plant crops. This system meant that the Egyptian state did not have to maintain a huge permanent workforce, and farmers had work and income during the season when they could not farm. Once the stone blocks arrived at the harbour near the pyramid site, they still had to be moved to the actual construction area and lifted into place. For this, the Egyptians used ramps. The exact design of these ramps is still debated, but most scholars believe they used a combination of straight ramps and spiral ramps that wound around the growing pyramid. The blocks were dragged up these ramps on wooden sledges, with workers pulling on ropes while other workers poured water on the sand in front of the sledges. This water helped compact the sand and reduce friction, making it easier to pull the heavy loads. The precision with which the pyramids were built is remarkable. The base of the Great Pyramid is almost perfectly level, with a deviation of less than an inch over its 750-foot length. The sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with incredible accuracy. This precision was achieved using simple but effective tools. The Egyptians used wooden squares and plumb bobs to ensure right angles and vertical alignment. They used the stars to align the pyramid sides with true north. They used measuring rods and ropes to lay out the dimensions accurately. The final touch on the pyramids was the casing stones, smooth white limestone blocks that covered the entire outer surface, making the pyramid gleam brilliantly in the desert sun. These casing stones were brought from the Tura quarries, famous for producing the finest white limestone in Egypt. They were fitted together so precisely that you could not fit a knife blade between them. Most of these casing stones were removed in later centuries and used for other buildings in Cairo, which is why the pyramids today have a stepped appearance rather than smooth sides. But in ancient times, covered in white limestone and topped with a gilded capstone, the pyramids would have been dazzling to behold. Building a pyramid was more than just an engineering project. It was a religious act, a way of ensuring the pharaoh's successful journey to the afterlife and, by extension, ensuring the continued prosperity of Egypt. The pharaoh was seen as a living god, the intermediary between the people and the divine realm. When the pharaoh died and was successfully resurrected in the afterlife, he would continue to watch over Egypt and ensure that the Nile flooded, the crops grew, and life continued. The pyramid complexes included not just the pyramid itself, but also mortuary temples where priests would make daily offerings to the deceased pharaoh's spirit, a causeway connecting the mortuary temple to a valley temple near the river, and smaller pyramids for queens and other family members. The entire complex was oriented toward the Nile, with the valley temple serving as the entrance point where the pharaoh's body would arrive by boat for the funeral ceremonies. Think about the connection between the pyramids and the Nile. The river provided the transportation that made construction possible. The river's flood provided the labor force. The river's annual cycle of flood, planting, and harvest provided the agricultural surplus that fed the workers. The river connected all of Egypt, allowing the pharaoh to command resources and labor from throughout the kingdom. Without the Nile, the pyramids, these monuments that have amazed humanity for millennia, could never have been built. As you lie here now, feeling more and more relaxed, think about the patience and persistence required to build a pyramid. Each block had to be quarried, shaped, transported by river, moved to the construction site, and carefully placed. This process was repeated millions of times, year after year, for 20 or 30 years to complete a single pyramid. There was no rushing, no shortcut, just steady, consistent work, day after day, with faith that the great project would eventually be completed. There is wisdom in this patience. In our modern world, we want everything immediately. We are frustrated by delays, by the slow pace of important work. But the ancient Egyptians knew that great things take time. They knew that steady, consistent effort, maintained over years or even decades, could accomplish what seemed impossible. They knew that work done with care and purpose would last forever. Let that wisdom settle into your mind as you relax more deeply. Let go of any impatience or frustration about things in your life that are taking longer than you wish. Trust that, like the slow rise of a pyramid, your own life is being built block by block, day by day, and that steady progress, even when it feels slow, is real progress. Trust in the process. Trust in time. Trust that, like the Nile flowing steadily toward the sea, you too are moving in the right direction at exactly the right pace. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 9. Children growing up along the Nile. Asterisk, asterisk. Have you ever wondered what it was like to be a child in ancient Egypt? What games did they play? What did they learn? How did they spend their days along the banks of the Nile? Tonight, let me take you into the world of ancient Egyptian childhood, a world that in some ways was very different from modern childhood, but in other ways was much the same. Children have always been children, after all, delighting in play, learning about the world, and dreaming of the future. As I tell you these stories, let yourself feel the innocence and joy of childhood, that simple happiness that we all remember, and let it bring peace to your heart. Children in ancient Egypt were treasured. The ancient Egyptians loved children and saw them as gifts from the gods. Families prayed for children, especially sons who would carry on the family name and take care of the parents in their old age. But daughters were valued too, and played important roles in family and society. Infant mortality was high in ancient times, so when a child survived past the dangerous first years of life, the parents were deeply grateful. Young children, up to about the age of 4 or 5, wore no clothes. The Egyptian climate was warm, and clothing for small children was unnecessary. They ran around naked, their skin bare to the sun and air. This might seem strange to us, but it was practical and normal in ancient Egypt. Children wore a special hairstyle called the side lock of youth, where the head was shaved except for a single lock of hair on the right side. This side lock identified them as children and was only removed when they reached adolescence and were considered adults. Babies and toddlers wore protective amulets, little charms that parents believed would keep them safe from harm, illness, and evil spirits. These amulets might be shaped like gods, animals, or symbols of protection. They were made from stone, clay, or faience, a glazed ceramic material that the Egyptians made in beautiful blue and green colours. The amulets were strung on cord and worn around the neck or wrist. Archaeological excavations have found many of these small amulets, touching reminders of parents' love and concern for their children thousands of years ago. Egyptian children played with toys, and many of these toys have survived for us to see in museums today. They had dolls made from wood, clay, or rags stuffed with papyrus reeds. Some dolls had movable arms and legs, attached with string so they could be posed. They had wooden animals, sometimes with wheels so they could be pulled along on a string. They had balls made from leather or papyrus, sewn together and stuffed. They had spinning tops, carved from wood and painted with bright colours. Children played games that we would recognise today. They played a game like leapfrog, taking turns jumping over each other's backs. They played tug-of-war, dividing into teams and pulling on a rope to see which side was stronger. They played versions of hopscotch, drawing patterns in the dirt and hopping through them. They played with marbles made from stone or clay. They wrestled and ran races, developing strength and agility. The Nile River was a natural playground for Egyptian children. They learned to swim at a young age, splashing in the shallow waters near the riverbank, under the watchful eyes of parents and older siblings. Swimming was not just fun, but necessary in a civilization centered on a river. Children who lived by the Nile needed to be comfortable in the water. They caught small fish and tadpoles with their hands or with simple nets. They waded through the marshes, looking for birds' eggs or interesting plants. They made small boats from reeds and watched them float away on the current. However, parents were also careful to teach their children about the dangers of the river. Crocodiles and hippopotamuses were real threats, and children learned from an early age to be cautious, to stay in the safe areas, to watch for signs of danger. This was part of growing up along the Nile, learning to respect the power of nature, learning that the river was both a blessing and something that demanded care and attention. As children grew older, around the age of 5 or 6, they began to learn the work that they would do as adults. For most children whose parents were farmers or craftspeople, this meant learning by doing. Boys would go to the fields with their fathers, learning to plough, to plant, to harvest. Girls would stay with their mothers, learning to grind grain, bake bread, weave cloth, and manage a household. This was not school in the formal sense, but it was education, passing down the skills and knowledge needed to survive and thrive. For a small number of children, usually boys from wealthier families, or from families of scribes, there was formal education. These children would attend schools, often attached to temples, where they learned to read and write hieratic script, the cursive form of hieroglyphics used for everyday documents. Learning to write was difficult and required years of practice. Students would copy texts over and over, memorizing classic literature, religious texts, and practical documents like letters and contracts. Being a scribe was one of the most desirable careers in ancient Egypt. Scribes did not have to do physical labor in the fields or construction sites. They worked in the shade, using their minds rather than their muscles. They kept records for the government, wrote letters for officials, calculated taxes, and managed the complex administration that kept Egypt running. Students training to be scribes were reminded constantly of how fortunate they were. One text written by a teacher to his students says, "Be a scribe and be freed from hard labor and protected from all kinds of work. You will be free from carrying the hoe and the basket." The scribes do not have to pay taxes, and they do not have to work with their hands. But whether children were learning to be farmers or craftspeople or scribes, their education included stories. Egyptian children grew up hearing the myths and legends of their gods, the stories of Osiris and Isis, of Horus and Set, of Ra, the sun god, travelling through the underworld each night. They learned about their pharaohs, the great kings who had ruled Egypt in the past. They learned about their ancestors, the family members who had lived before them. These stories were not just entertainment. They were teaching about values, about how to live, about what it meant to be Egyptian. Children also learned music. Many Egyptian children learned to play simple instruments like flutes or drums or to sing songs. Music was an important part of Egyptian life, played at religious ceremonies, at festivals, at family gatherings. Learning to make music was learning to participate fully in the life of the community. As children approached adolescence, usually around the age of 12 or 13, they underwent rituals that marked their transition to adulthood. The sidelock of youth was cut off in a ceremony. Boys might be circumcised, a procedure that was common in ancient Egypt and marked entry into full membership in the community. Girls began to wear more jewelry and makeup, signalling that they were now young women. Within a few years, most would be married and beginning families of their own, continuing the cycle of life along the Nile. Childhood in ancient Egypt was shorter than childhood today. Children took on adult responsibilities earlier, but they also experienced joys that modern children might envy. They spent their days outdoors, swimming in the river, playing in the fields, working alongside their parents, and learning skills that connected them directly to the land and the water that sustained them. They grew up with a sense of purpose, knowing their place in the family and the community. They grew up with stories that connected them to thousands of years of history and tradition. As you relax now, let yourself remember your own childhood. Remember the games you played, the things you learned, the dreams you had. Remember the feeling of being cared for, of being part of a family, of having your whole life ahead of you full of possibilities. Let those memories bring you peace and comfort. Let them remind you that no matter how old you are now, there is still a child inside you who knows how to play, how to imagine, how to find joy in simple things. The children who played along the banks of the Nile 4,000 years ago are long gone, but their joy, their laughter, their innocent happiness still echoes across the centuries. Children in every age and every place experience that same wonder, that same delight in being alive. You experienced it once, You can touch it again in your memories and in your dreams. Let those good feelings surround you now like a warm blanket. Let them carry you gently into the peaceful sleep of a child who feels safe, loved, and completely content. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 10. Sailing and Trading on the Great River Highway. Asterisk, asterisk. Have you ever thought about how people and goods travelled in ancient times before there were roads or vehicles with engines? In ancient Egypt, the answer was simple and elegant. You travelled on the Nile. The river was not just a source of water and food. It was the main highway of Egyptian civilization, a natural transportation route that connected the entire country from south to north. Tonight, let me tell you about sailing and trading on the Nile. And as I do, imagine yourself as a merchant or sailor, travelling up and down this great river, watching the landscape slowly change as you drift peacefully along. Let the gentle rocking motion of a boat on calm water lull you into deeper and deeper relaxation. The Nile was perfect for transportation because it provided two different ways to travel. If you wanted to go north, toward the Mediterranean Sea, you simply let the current carry you. The Nile flows from south to north, so a boat floating on the river would naturally move in that direction. Sailors could make this journey even faster by rowing, but in many cases, the current alone was enough. But what if you wanted to go south, against the current? Here is where Egyptian geography provided another gift. The prevailing winds in Egypt blow from north to south, from the Mediterranean inland, so boats travelling south could raise their sails and let the wind push them upstream. This made two-way travel relatively easy and meant that the Nile was a true highway with traffic moving in both directions. The ancient Egyptians became expert boat builders and sailors. They built many different types of boats for different purposes. For local travel or fishing, the small papyrus skiffs we talked about earlier were perfect. These lightweight boats could be easily carried by one or two people and launched wherever needed. They were ideal for crossing the river, for navigating through marshes, or for fishing in shallow waters. For longer journeys and for carrying cargo, the Egyptians built larger wooden boats. These boats were constructed from planks of wood, usually acacia wood that grew in Egypt or cedar wood imported from Lebanon. The planks were fitted together and tied with rope rather than being nailed, a technique that made the boats flexible enough to withstand the stresses of travel. The seams between planks were caulked with reeds and pitch to make them watertight. These wooden boats had masts that could be raised to hold sails. Egyptian sails were made from woven papyrus or linen cloth, stretched across wooden frames. The sails were rectangular and quite large, designed to catch as much wind as possible. A boat travelling south would raise its sail, and with a good wind, could make steady progress upstream. A boat travelling north would lower its sail and drift with the current, using oars and steering oars to maintain course and avoid sandbanks. Imagine yourself on one of these boats, setting out on a trading journey. Let us say you are travelling from Thebes in the south to Memphis in the north, a journey of several hundred miles that might take a week or more depending on wind and current. You have loaded your boat with goods to trade, perhaps pottery made in your workshop, or jars of honey, or bolts of fine linen cloth. Your boat is not large by modern standards, perhaps 30 or 40 feet long, but it is sturdy and well built, and you trust it completely. You push off from the dock in the early morning, when the air is still cool and the river is peaceful. The sun is just beginning to rise over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. You and your crew, perhaps 3 or 4 other men, lower the sail since you are travelling north with the current. You settle yourself comfortably, using your steering oar to keep the boat in the main channel where the current is strongest. The river carries you gently along. You pass fields of grain, still green and growing after being planted following the flood. You pass mud brick villages where people are beginning their daily tasks, fetching water, preparing breakfast, leading animals out to graze. Children playing on the riverbank wave at you, and you wave back. Other boats pass you going the opposite direction, their sails raised to catch the wind, and you exchange greetings with their crews. The rhythm of the journey is slow and peaceful. There is no hurry, no schedule to keep beyond the natural rhythm of day and night. During the heat of the day, you might pull to shore and rest in the shade, eating bread and onions and drinking beer, waiting for the heat to lessen before continuing. In the evening, you pull to shore again, tie your boat securely, and make camp for the night. You and your crew sit by a small fire, cooking fish you caught during the day, telling stories and jokes, looking up at the stars that fill the sky from horizon to horizon. The next morning, you continue your journey. Day by day, the landscape slowly changes. The valley narrows and widens. The colour of the cliffs along the river changes from yellow to red to white. You pass temples and towns, some small and others large. You pass the necropolis areas on the west bank, where tombs are cut into the cliffs. You pass the pyramids, those great monuments that never fail to inspire awe, no matter how many times you have seen them. Along the way, you might stop to trade. You pull your boat to shore at a town and carry some of your goods to the market. There, you spread them out on a mat and wait for customers. Trading in ancient Egypt was done by barter, exchanging one type of goods for another, with the value measured in units called deben. You trade your pottery for grain, or your honey for copper, or your linen for leather. You haggle and negotiate, enjoying the social interaction as much as the trade itself. This is how business is done, face to face, with people you might see again on future journeys, building relationships as well as making profits. The Nile trade connected all of Egypt. Goods from the south, from Nubia and the regions beyond Egypt's borders, came down the river. Gold and ivory, ebony wood and exotic animal skins, incense and precious stones all flowed north along the Nile. Goods from the north, from the delta and from foreign lands across the Mediterranean flowed south. Wine and olive oil, cedar wood and bronze tools all moved along the river highway. And within Egypt itself, the products of different regions were constantly being exchanged. Pottery from one area, grain from another, fish from the marshes, stone from the quarries, all flowing back and forth on the eternal current of the Nile. This trade made Egypt prosperous. It allowed specialization, with different regions producing what they were best at and trading for what they needed. It spread ideas and knowledge throughout the kingdom. A merchant who travelled the river would hear news from different places, learn about new techniques and technologies, and carry that knowledge back home. The Nile was not just a transportation route. It was a communication network that kept Egypt unified and connected. The larger boats on the Nile could carry truly impressive loads. During the construction of temples and pyramids, massive stone blocks weighing many tons were transported by boat. One ancient text describes a boat built to carry 2 great obelisks, tall pillars of stone weighing hundreds of tons. The boat was over 200 feet long, requiring a huge crew to row it when the wind was not favourable. These enormous boats were engineering marvels, demonstrating the Egyptian mastery of both boat building and river navigation. The Egyptians also used their boats for military purposes. Warships patrolled the river and protected Egypt's borders. These boats were longer and narrower than cargo boats, designed for speed and maneuverability. They carried soldiers and archers who could fire arrows at enemies on shore or on other boats. The Nile made it possible for the pharaoh to project power throughout his kingdom, to respond quickly to threats, to move troops wherever they were needed. For all their practical uses, boats also had deep spiritual significance in ancient Egypt. The gods themselves were believed to travel in boats. Ra, the sun god, sailed across the sky in a celestial boat during the day, then travelled through the underworld in a different boat at night, fighting monsters and challenges before being reborn at dawn. Priests carried statues of gods in ceremonial boats during festivals, as we talked about earlier. The boat was a sacred symbol, representing journey and transformation, the ability to move from one place or one state of being to another. As you lie here now, imagine yourself on that ancient boat, floating peacefully down the Nile. Feel the gentle rocking motion, steady and rhythmic like a heartbeat or like breathing. Feel the sun warm on your skin, not too hot, just pleasant and comfortable. Hear the quiet sounds of water lapping against the boat's sides, the occasional call of a bird, the soft murmur of conversation from your companions. Smell the river, that particular scent of fresh water and wet earth and growing things. You have nowhere you need to be except here, now, on this boat, on this river. You have nothing you need to do except let the current carry you. You trust the river. You trust your boat. You trust that you are moving in the right direction at exactly the right pace. There is no rush, no anxiety, no worry. There is only the present moment, only the peaceful flow of the river, only the gentle journey from one place to another, from waking to sleeping, from tension to relaxation, from worry to peace. Let the river carry you now. Let go of any need to control or to steer. The river knows where it is going. The river has been flowing for millions of years and will flow for millions more. You are safe on its waters. You are held and supported. You are travelling peacefully toward rest, toward dreams, toward the deep, refreshing sleep that restores and renews. Let the river take you there. Let yourself flow with its gentle current. Let yourself drift into the deepest, most peaceful sleep, floating on the eternal waters of the Nile. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 11. The Eternal River. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Asterisk, asterisk. We have journeyed together through ancient Egypt tonight, exploring the Nile River and the legends that grew along its banks, like the lotus and papyrus that once filled its waters. We have met gods and goddesses, farmers and fishermen, pharaohs and ordinary people, all connected by the river that made their civilization possible. Now, as we prepare to close our journey, let me share some final thoughts about the Nile, about what it meant then and what it can mean to us now as we seek peace and rest. The Nile River has been flowing for millions of years, long before humans ever walked along its banks. It will continue flowing long after we are gone. There is something deeply comforting about this, is there not? In a world that changes so rapidly, where nothing seems permanent, the Nile remains. Its course has changed over the millennia, yes, and modern dams have altered its flow, but the essential truth of it remains. Water flows from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, bringing life to millions of people, just as it has always done. The ancient Egyptians understood this permanence, this eternal quality of the river. They built their civilization on the certainty that the Nile would flood every year, that the seasons would turn, that the cycles they depended on would continue. This gave them a sense of security and stability that allowed them to achieve remarkable things. They built monuments that have lasted thousands of years. They developed systems of writing, mathematics, and engineering that influenced all subsequent civilizations. They created art of stunning beauty and wisdom that still moves us today. But beyond all these achievements, the ancient Egyptians left us something else, something perhaps even more valuable. They left us an example of how to live in harmony with nature, how to respect the cycles of the natural world, how to see divinity in the river and the crops and the flood that sustains life. In our modern world, where we have become so disconnected from nature, where water comes from taps and food comes from stores, and we rarely think about the soil and sun and rain that make life possible, we could benefit from remembering the ancient Egyptian perspective. The legends we have explored tonight, the stories of Hapi and Sobek and Osiris and Isis, are not just ancient myths to be studied and analysed. They are wisdom teachings, passed down through generations, carrying truths about the human experience and our relationship with the natural world. When the Egyptians said that Hapi poured water from his jars to create the flood, they were expressing gratitude for abundance. When they said that Isis's tears caused the Nile to rise, they were acknowledging that grief and life are intertwined, that from loss comes renewal. When they honoured the crocodile as Sobek, they were teaching themselves to respect even the dangerous aspects of nature, to seek balance rather than domination. These are lessons we still need today. We need to remember to be grateful for the water we drink and the food we eat. We need to remember that loss and grief are part of life's cycles, and that renewal always follows, even when we cannot see it yet. We need to remember to respect nature, to seek balance with the world around us rather than trying to conquer and control everything. The ancient Egyptians also understood something profound about rest and renewal. They knew that after the hard work of harvest came the season of flood, when the fields rested underwater and farmers could rest from their agricultural labour. They knew that night follows day, that sleep restores us, that rest is not laziness but a necessary part of the cycle of life. In their mythology, even the sun god Ra rested each night, travelling through the underworld to be renewed before rising again in the morning. This is wisdom we desperately need in our modern world, where we are encouraged to work constantly, to be productive every moment, to feel guilty about resting. The ancient Egyptians would have thought this was foolish. They knew that rest is sacred, that sleep is necessary, that our bodies and minds need time to restore themselves, just as the fields need time to rest and be renewed by the flood. So tonight, as you finally drift into deep sleep, give yourself permission to rest without guilt. Let yourself be like the fields during Akhet, resting under peaceful waters, being renewed by forces larger than yourself. Let yourself be like the sun god Ra, travelling through the dark realm of sleep to emerge renewed and bright in the morning. Let yourself be like the Nile itself, flowing constantly but peacefully, not rushed or anxious, simply following its natural course. The gentle flow of the Nile has been a source of meditation and peace for countless people throughout history. The ancient Egyptians sat on its banks and watched its waters flow, finding in that eternal movement a reflection of the divine order of the universe. The river never stops, never doubts its path, never worries about what lies ahead. It simply flows, moment by moment, following the landscape, finding the easiest path, always moving forward but never in a hurry. This is the quality of mind we seek when we meditate, when we try to find peace and relaxation. We try to be like the river, present in each moment, flowing naturally without force or struggle, trusting that we are moving in the right direction even when we cannot see very far ahead. This is the gift the Nile offers us, not just in ancient history, but right now, in this moment, as you lie here seeking rest. Imagine the Nile flowing through your mind, carrying away all the worries and anxieties that trouble you, all the regrets about the past and fears about the future. The river simply carries them away, gently but irresistibly, leaving your mind clear and peaceful like the surface of still water reflecting the stars. Feel the flow of the river as your own breath, flowing in and out, not forced but natural, bringing life and peace with each gentle cycle. The ancient Egyptians believed that after death, if you had lived a good life, your soul would be at peace, existing in a paradise called the Field of Reeds, which was imagined as a perfected version of Egypt, with abundant crops and plentiful water. In this paradise, you would live forever in peace and joy, reunited with loved ones who had died before you. You would work in the fields, but the work would be easy and pleasant. You would feast on good food and drink. You would sail on the river in a beautiful boat. You would be at peace. This vision of paradise was simply an eternal version of the best moments of life in Egypt. The satisfaction of a good harvest, the pleasure of food and drink shared with family, the joy of sailing on the Nile on a beautiful day, the peace of evening when work is done and you can rest. The ancient Egyptians did not imagine paradise as radically different from their earthly life. They imagined it as the same life, but perfected, without suffering or hardship, only the good moments lasting forever. There is wisdom in this too. Heaven, paradise, peace. We do not need to wait for death to experience these things. They are available to us right now, in moments of rest, in moments of gratitude, in moments when we stop struggling and simply allow ourselves to be present and at peace. This moment, right now, as you lie here relaxed and peaceful, listening to the story of the ancient river, this can be a taste of paradise. This is the peace that the ancient Egyptians sought and found in their connection to the Nile. As I bring our journey to a close, I want to thank you for traveling with me back through time to ancient Egypt, to the banks of the sacred Nile River. I hope these stories have brought you peace and relaxation, that the gentle flow of the river has carried away your stress and worry, that you have felt some connection to those ancient people who lived their lives so differently from us, yet felt the same human emotions, the same need for rest and peace and meaning. The Nile continues to flow through Egypt, even today, even now as you lie here thousands of miles away and thousands of years after the time of the pharaohs. The same water that the ancient Egyptians drank and bathed in and used to water their crops still flows from Africa to the Mediterranean. The sun still rises over the eastern desert and sets over the western mountains. The cycles continue, eternal and unbroken, connecting us to every human who has ever lived and every human who will ever live. Let yourself feel part of that connection now. Let yourself be just one small wave in the endless river of humanity, flowing from the past into the future, carried by forces larger than yourself. You do not need to struggle or fight. You simply need to flow, to rest, to trust that the river knows where it is going. The ancient Egyptians had a word, Ma'at, which meant truth, justice, harmony, and balance. It represented the proper order of the universe, the way things should be. When Ma'at was maintained, when everything was in its proper place and proper balance, there was peace and prosperity. The flowing of the Nile was one of the great symbols of Ma'at, the river following its eternal course, bringing life and renewal in perfect balance. Let Ma'at flow through you now. Let everything find its proper place and proper balance within you. Let truth and harmony and peace settle into every part of your being. Let yourself be perfectly balanced like the ancient Egyptian scales that weighed the heart against the feather of Ma'at to determine if a soul was worthy of paradise. Let your heart be as light as that feather, unburdened by worry or fear, floating peacefully like a papyrus boat on the gentle waters of the Nile. Breathe slowly and deeply, imagining that you are breathing in the clean, fresh air above the Nile at dawn, when the sun is just beginning to rise and the air is cool and perfect. Breathe out any remaining tension or stress, releasing it like lotus petals falling onto the water's surface and floating away on the current. With each breath, become more and more relaxed, more and more peaceful, more and more connected to the eternal flow of life. The stories of the Nile have been told for thousands of years, passed down from generation to generation, from ancient priests to their students, from parents to children, from travelers to eager listeners. Tonight, you have heard these stories, and in hearing them, you have become part of that ancient tradition. You are now a keeper of these legends, a person who knows about Hapi and Sobek, about Osiris and Isis, about the sacred river that gave birth to one of humanity's greatest civilizations. May these legends bring you peace, not just tonight, but in all the nights to come. When you need to relax, remember the gentle flow of the Nile. When you need hope, remember the annual flood that always came, bringing renewal after drought. When you need to remember that life continues and cycles repeat, think of Osiris, dying and being reborn, teaching that transformation is not an ending but a new beginning. The river flows on, eternal and peaceful, carrying its precious gift of water through the desert, turning death into life, barrenness into abundance. You are part of that same flow, that same transformation, that same eternal cycle. Rest now in that knowledge. Rest in the peace of the flowing river. Rest in the certainty that just as the Nile has flowed for millions of years and will flow for millions more, your essential self is also eternal, part of something much larger and longer than this single lifetime. Sleep now, peaceful traveller. Sleep by the banks of the ancient Nile. Feel the cool mud beneath you, hear the gentle lapping of water against the shore, see the stars bright above you in the clear desert sky. You are safe. You are protected. You are part of the eternal flow. The river carries you gently into dreams, into rest, into the deep peace that the ancient Egyptians knew when they laid down to sleep beside their beloved river, trusting that tomorrow the sun would rise again, the Nile would flow again, and life would continue in its perfect, eternal cycle. Flow with the river, rest in its gentle current. Let the legends of ancient Egypt carry you softly into the deepest, most peaceful sleep. The Nile flows on, and so do you, eternal and at peace, connected to all that was, all that is, and all that will ever be. Rest now, rest peacefully. Rest in the gentle flow of the Nile River, now and forever. The journey is complete. The stories have been told. The river flows eternal. And you, dear listener, can now surrender completely to sleep, knowing that like the Nile, like the cycles of flood and growth and harvest, Like the eternal rhythms of nature itself, you too are part of something beautiful, something meaningful, something that flows forever. Sleep well, sleep deeply, sleep in the gentle embrace of the Nile.